Poisonings in the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. 1. Why Archpriest Lev Lebedev was poisoned. The conquest of the Church abroad by Chekist Moscow has a strong taste of criminality. The KGB killed many of its priests, including the best ones. Some in the Russian emigration knew about this but preferred to keep quiet. Some out of false patriotism, others because they themselves worked for the KGB. Therefore, I had to use all my experience as a former Soviet intelligence analyst to recreate an approximate picture of events by interviewing many people. At the end of April 1998, a Russian priest from Kursk, Archpriest Lev Lebedev, died a strange death in the building of the New York Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. He was an implacable opponent of unification with the Moscow Patriarchate. The first hierarch of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, Metropolitan Vitaly, invited him to speak before the bishops in order to open their eyes to this destruction. But the eyes of the bishops were already fixed on Moscow. They preferred to quickly get rid of Metropolitan Vitaly himself and removed him from office. Russian priest Lev Lebedev presented his report to those who had arrived at the council and was soon found dead in the guest room in the Synod building before he lived to see the opening of the Bishops' Council on May 5, 1998. As Far Pavel Ivashevich, former cell attendant of Metropolitan Vitaly, told me, it was easy for an outsider to enter this room through the balcony door. Many of the young synodal employees often did this when they lost the keys to the front door. The KGB probably knew about this. Who was the Kursk archpriest's overnight guest, a militant from the Russian consulate in New York, registered there as a sportsman mass player, or an illegal Russian intelligence agent? The recent murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London shows that the KGB has many ways. Some of the eyewitnesses of those events believe that Far Lev Lebedev was poisoned on the Aeroflot plane on the way to New York, since he felt unwell after his arrival. Well, that happens, since Aeroflot remains a branch of the KGB to this day, and they also tried to poison Anna Politkovskaya in 2004 on the plane so that she would not end up in Beslan. By that time, all power in the ROCOR Synod had already been seized by the pro-Moscow group, and it silenced the report. Its text was even considered lost, but we are reproducing the report from one private archive. One can see God's providence in this, for the prophetic meaning of Archpriest Lev Lebedev's words is manifested precisely in our days, when the heretical Moscow Patriarchate began to collapse even before its unification with the Church abroad. After all, the rebellion of the Chukotka MP Bishop Diomid is only the beginning. Here is the text of the report by Archpriest Lev Lebedev. To the Bishops' Council of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, 1998, New York. 1. The period being experienced. The world, humanity, sinking ever more rapidly into the state of Sodom and Gomorrah, are moving irresistibly towards the completion of the new Tower of Babel, the new world order, that is, towards the Antichrist. After him, the second glorious coming of Christ. This is the essence of the moment in time we are experiencing. 2. The position of orthodoxy. Against the background of these global phenomena and in connection with them, it is especially sad that the majority of once orthodox local churches, through the ecumenical and interreligious movement, are actively drawn into global construction and are drawing their flock into the ziggurat, center of this Babylon. The only island of God's truth in this world has remained until now, the Russian Church abroad. Some old calendarist associations in Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, and individual zealots of orthodoxy in other countries have become small islands of firm standing in the truth. 3. The position of the Moscow Patriarchate. The Moscow Patriarchate, illegal, non-canonical, In its origin, by its very nature, is such a church organization, which, since 1927, under the guise of serving Christ, actively serves the Antichrist. Therefore, it is not at all surprising, but quite natural, that now the MP is actively participating in the completion of the construction of the Babylon of the New World Order, which is accurately and correctly stated in the Appeal of the Conference of Russian Bishops of the ROCOR from October 30th, November 12th, in Yalta. Some outbursts of anti-ecumenical sentiments within the MP, as well as protests by individual ministers against countless other deviations from the truth, are nothing more than weak convulsions of a dying or already dead organism. All this is explained by the fact that the current Russian-speaking population of the Russian Federation, including its Orthodox believing part, is in a state of total faith of lies, characteristic of people of the times of the Antichrist, and described by the Apostle Paul as God's punishment for the fact that they did not receive the love of the truth. 2 Thess 2:10-11. 4. The situation of Russian speakers in Russia. The entire Russian Orthodox people as a whole, about 80 million great Russians alone, one with Holy Russia at its core, were physically destroyed in the period from 1917 to 1945 in just 28 years. Thus, the Lord arranged for the Russian people, through the crucifixion on the historical Golgotha, a victorious resurrection into the heavenly Jerusalem of the Kingdom of Heaven, removing this people from the modern historical process. At the same time, from 1917 onwards, a new Soviet people, a new historical community, as the party and government of the USSR put it in 1977, was artificially cultivated in the USSR. But in reality, this new Soviet people turned out not even to be a people, since there is no sense of unity, but a conglomerate of the Russian-speaking population, which crumbled into rubble after 1991. Therefore, except for a small remainder of Russians abroad, the Russian people no longer exist on Earth. 5. The state of Russian-speaking believers. Russian-speaking believers in Russia are characterized by the prevalence of earthly interests over spiritual ones, a fraudulent nature of psychology, a belief in lies, cowardice, little faith, and filthiness, Reverend 21:8. Witchcraft and quackery have become extremely widespread. No one seeks Christ and his truth. Everyone seeks their own. The most indicative phenomenon was that after 1990 to 1991, in an environment of real freedom of conscience in Russia, there was no mass nationwide conversion of Russian speakers to the Church, to Christ. There is a slight increase in faith and an influx of young people into the Church, but now these phenomena are also declining. If we do not exaggerate the data, then at present there are no more than 15-20 million Orthodox believers in the Russian Federation, and those who regularly go to church are half as many. According to the MP, if in 1993, income from voluntary donations from people made up 43% of all the income of the Patriarchate, then in 1997 they made up only 6%. The Patriarchate receives the rest from usury, trade in oil, vodka, tobacco, bush legs, other types of business, as well as from very unclear foreign sources. Sometimes they say that even today in Russia, there are many kind, good people, but there are many of them among Catholics and Protestants in any Western countries. They also say that in Russia you can still meet, even in the bosom of the MP, pious people who zealously strive in prayer and fasting. But you need to know that these are not the rays of sunrise, but the last rays of sunset. In a large garbage dump you can find antiques, icons, and even gold items. But all this is not a palace or a temple, but a garbage dump. 100 years ago, in 1899, Bishop Anthony Krapovitsky referring to the dischurched part of Russian society of his time, wrote, "This is no longer a people but a rotting corpse that takes its rotting for life, and only moles, worms, and vile insects live on it and in it. For in a living body there would be no satisfaction of their greed, there would be no life for them." Talberg, History of the Russian Church. Jordanville, 1959, p. 831. At the end of the last beginning of the current 20th century, this rotting part of the Russian population amounted to approximately only 5 to 6%. Now, at the end of the 20th century, it makes up 94 to 95% of Russia. The rotting corpse is the entire Russian Federation. 6. The position of the ROCOR in relation to the MP. It is impossible not to admit that such a state of the population as a whole is entirely consistent with the apostate, heretical, and criminal state of the overwhelming majority of the MP hierarchy as one of the moles or worms greedily devouring in a rotting corpse what can still be grabbed and devoured. What could the Russian Church abroad have in common with the Moscow Patriarchate in this case? Nothing. Hence, any dialogues or conversations with the MP, with the purpose of finding out what divides us and what unites us, are either the height of misunderstanding the essence of things, or a betrayal of the truth of God and the Church. Literally everything divides us, and nothing unites us, except perhaps the external appearance of churches, the vestments of the clergy, and the order of services, and even then, not in everything. Therefore, it is necessary to clearly understand and officially confirm that today the ROCOR is not a part of the Russian Church, but the only legitimate Russian Church in its entirety. It is also necessary to understand that this is understood by the Moscow Patriarchate. That is why it seeks recognition of itself, as it is, without renouncing apostasy and heresies, by the Council of the ROCOR. Such recognition of the MP by the ROCOR would give the MP the visibility of complete legitimacy into the eyes of the entire world. But this cannot be allowed. The ROCOR needs to abandon dreams and illusions about the rebirth of Russia. If there is no extraordinary and unpredictable intervention of God in earthly affairs, and by his permission and providence, everything will continue as it is now, then it is all over with Russia. God grant that, only because of excessive attachment to it, we do not fall into the abyss of destruction together with it. Now we only need to firmly hold on to what we have. And if the soul still aches for Russian speakers in Russia, then only by constant and firm confession of the MP, and not by flirting with it, can we save those in Russia who are still seeking salvation and can accept it. It is therefore necessary to return to the position of irreconcilability towards the MP, which the Russian Church abroad initially occupied. And it is impossible, under the pretext of the benefit of the Church and improving its office work, to shake the authority of the first hierarch of the ROCOR, who is capable of distinguishing truth from lies and discerning spirits. Recently, the ROCOR has suffered a series of disasters, one after another. Particularly terrifying is the murder of the custodian of the Iveron Mur streaming icon, José Muñoz, and the hiding of the icon itself. Let us recall that its miracles began in 1982. Before that, in 1981, the ROCOR glorified the new Martyrs of Russia, headed by the royal family, and in 1983 anathema was proclaimed against the ecumenical heresy. It is clear that the Mur streaming of the Iveron icon was a sign of God's approval of a firm stand in the truth against all lies, including the lies of the MP. But after the very vague decisions of the Bishops' Council of the ROCOR in 1993 to 1994, and further steps by some of our hierarchs towards rapprochement with the MP, one after another, such disasters began, which clearly testify to the retreat of God's favor towards our Church, for its departure from the truth. How many more disasters do the supporters of fraternization with the criminal and heretical MP want to bring upon our heads? Well, could the KGB agents leave such a conclusion unpunished? Could they allow ROCOR archpriest Lev Lebedev to continue his hostile activities? The cause of his death was not determined, although the medicine in New York is still better than in Kursk. Father Lev's body was sent home with suspicious haste. However, one unexpected event in the recent autumn of 2010 shed additional light on the circumstances of the death of Archpriest Lev Lebedev. Then a sexual scandal erupted around monk Vsevolod Filipiev, who arrived at the Jordanville Monastery in the early 90s from the Russian Federation, and became one of the main figures in the matter of subordinating the church abroad to Moscow. His biography is very strange. Here is how Wikipedia describes it. He was born in Moscow on July 5, 1969, into a family of communists. In 1990, he joined the Brotherhood of the Valam Monastery, where his spiritual father was Hieroschema monk Raphael Berestov. The question inevitably arises: what did he do before he was 21? What is his civilian profession? Did he serve military service? And if not, then why? After all, monasticism does not exempt one from military service, otherwise hundreds of thousands of conscripts would flock to Russian monasteries to avoid difficult military service. According to the rules in the Russian Federation, one must first serve in the army, pay off other debts to the world, and then go to a monastery. But all this, alas, is shrouded in mystery. However, the following paragraph from Wikipedia generally looks like a joke. In 1992, having become fascinated by the work of Seraphim Rose, he moved to the United States, where he joined the Brotherhood of the Holy Trinity Monastery. Let's, dear readers, all get carried away by the work of Seraphim Rose and move to live in the USA. But will they accept us there? That is the question. All such inconsistencies, strange coincidences, and omissions indicate the involvement of the special services. Moreover, our monk could well have graduated from some KGB school by the age of 21. The timing coincides, since studying in such a school takes 4 years. This can also explain the lack of military service, since all Russian special services are military organizations. If you ended up among their military personnel, you no longer need to pull the soldier's strap. It was as if they were waiting for him in the Jordanville Monastery, which is also quite possible because it was already full of Soviet agents. For some reason, Vsevolod Filipiev immediately became the right hand of the then head of the ROCOR, Metropolitan Loris, and was constantly with him until his death. After which the monk Filipiev immediately left America and showed up in Moscow. And in October 2010, video footage was posted on the internet with scenes of the monk's falls into sin and his phone conversations with prostitutes. It turned out that he suffers from a sadomasochistic complex and a number of venereal diseases, and beats prostitutes with a whip and introduces them to other men. Of course, for a civilian, this is not a scandal, but for a monk, and such a famous one at that. These events showed that he was not a monk at all, but most likely just an intelligence operative. Having arrived in Moscow, his homeland, after a successfully completed mission, he threw off his boring cassock and relaxed. It happens to everyone. Is this a scandal for an intelligence officer? Alas, yes. In today's Russian special services, now deprived of the corrosive party control, free love and sexual deviations flourish. The late Alexander Litvinenko, poisoned in London in 2006, told me about this. But outwardly, everything looks decent. Officers keep their mouths shut. Sexual secrets do not go beyond the department. The FSB is accused of anything but sexual promiscuity. But if an intelligence officer allows himself to discuss his sexual relations with prostitutes on the phone, which can be tapped, then this means that he has lost his vigilance. And this is unacceptable for an officer, and it must be stopped. I fully admit that the compromising materials about Vsevolod Filipiev were leaked to the internet by the Foreign Intelligence Service, so that other intelligence officers would not dare to do the same. But overall, this is a soft, paternal punishment. After all, no one even tried to kill the monk Vsevolod, right? It is believed that after this the monk hastily left Russia and hides his whereabouts, calling it monastic solitude. Although he could very well live peacefully in Moscow in one of the safe houses belonging to the SVR Intelligence Service or the FSB Counterintelligence Service. However, this scandal once again attracted the attention of journalists to the very suspicious Filipiev family. It turned out that it was with the parents of this depraved monk that Archpriest Lev Lebedev stayed in Moscow the night before his flight to America. But we in the emigre community never talked about this. The monk's mother, Tatiana Filipieva, had been flying to the US from Moscow for many years and was involved in the affairs of the church abroad. Aeroflot flights were at her disposal, where she worked as a psychologist. This circumstance seems very strange to me. Tell me, dear readers, hand on heart, have you ever met a psychologist among the staff of Aeroflot international flights? I have never met one. I have never even heard of them, although I worked in the scientific and technical intelligence of the KGB, which is closely connected with Aeroflot. Most of its officers are employees and even heads of Aeroflot foreign representative offices. Among them, I had many friends who told me about the difficult situation among Aeroflot employee galleries, about various funny cases. They warned me that during the flight I should avoid any conversations with the stewardesses because they are all KGB agents. The Chekists question them after each flight, and they need to report something, so they report everything they heard. Pilots are also unreliable people, said my friends. You need to keep your ears open with them. But the Chekists never mentioned any psychologists flying abroad. And why do you need a psychologist on a flight? Just to take up space, to take away precious currency from the motherland. If some stewardess has psychological difficulties during the flight, she will simply be removed from international flights and another one will be sent in her place. That's all psychology. In the Russian Federation, psychological issues are resolved simply in a soldierly manner, and the psychological preparation of flight personnel for flights is carried out, as is known, before the flight and not during it. However, Tatiana Filipieva is indeed a psychologist, a PhD. She is widely known among the parishioners of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, especially in Washington. And none of them, it seems, wondered why she travels here as if it were her home. Yes, I admit that she could well have been sent on inspection trips abroad from time to time, but very rarely, as is customary in Russian institutions. This means that she was assigned another job, on the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. It is clear that the KGB was very interested in seeing the Washington community of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad through the eyes of a psychologist in order to find a suitable contingent for recruitment. The famous priest and writer Mikhail Ardov told me that during one of his flights to the USA in the late 90s, he met Tatiana Filipieva. More precisely, she herself approached him on the plane, having seen the cassock. She said that her son is a monk. He used to serve on Valam, and now he serves in the Jordanville Monastery. Father Mikhail Ardov could not help but smile ironically, because that doesn't happen. The Chekist monk Filipiev also has a stepfather. I have no documentary evidence of his occupation. As priests I know in Russia told me, he is a police chief, but he works in the police that deals with foreigners and is therefore under the jurisdiction of the FSB. The KGB past and present of the Filipiev family were no secret to our editorial board, Vladimir Yulin writes in the newspaper Right View. Vsevolod's stepfather and mother, Tatiana were the last people to communicate with the church historian, Archpriest Lev Lebedev. On the eve of his sudden death in New York, he had dinner and spent the night in their Moscow apartment, and Filipiev Sr. drove Fyar Lev to the airport. Foreigners unanimously claim that Fyar Lev Lebedev died from poisoning with an unknown toxin. At the Bishops' Council of the ROCOR in 1998, he was supposed to give a report against reunification with the ROCMP. Tatiana Filipieva was not ashamed to compose memories of the last meeting with Father Lev, and this work was undertaken for the sake of the last phrase summary. After arriving in New York, Father Lev quietly, peacefully, and painlessly passed away in the sleep of the righteous. It has now become clear that under the new Metropolitan Hilarion, monk Vsevolod Filipiev heads a certain orthodox military mission, interacting with the FSB Army and Navy. A similar synodal department from the Russian Orthodox Church is headed by the notorious Father Dmitry Smirnov. So his current national disgrace can be called the resident's mistake. Point 2, author's note. Please note, dear readers, Monk Vsevolod heads a mission interacting with the FSB on U.S. territory. Russian intelligence is now working here, openly, and after this, Americans are somehow surprised by the scale of Russian espionage. I wonder if we will ever find out who is responsible for the martyrdom of the monk José Muñoz, whose close friend the werewolf in a cassock publicly called himself. Vladimir Yulin continues, and where, in whose hands will the myrrh-streaming Iveron Montreal icon of the Mother of God, a holy relic of the Russian diaspora, disappear after the murder of its guardian be found? 3. It turns out that the ubiquitous monk Filipiev could have had something to do with the death of José Muñoz. A bit too much, isn't it? But from the KGB's point of view, this is a great success. I wonder what order they gave him. I think it was the Order of Friendship of Peoples. Intelligence officers are usually awarded this. And as for the missing myrrh-streaming Iveron Montreal icon of the Mother of God, it may well be stored in the Lubyanka cellars. After all, its disappearance did cause confusion in the church abroad, which to some extent contributed to the transfer of most of it under the control of the KGB. But let's return to the FSB mission in America. Congratulations on its behalf were received by the participants of the evening in memory of Metropolitan Laurus, a traitor to the church abroad, which took place on April 14, 2011, in the A.I. Solzhenitsyn House of Russian Abroad in Moscow. These congratulations were signed by the current head of the ROCOR MP Metropolitan Hilarion. This indicated that the military espionage mission continues to operate successfully in the USA, despite the temporary absence of Vsevolod Filipiev there. However, from the place of monastic solitude, he sent his poem about the prayerful soul of Metropolitan Laurus for that evening. As if nothing had happened, this means that he will soon appear in public and even come to the USA. After all, at one time he, as a clergyman, received American citizenship without any problems. The role of the evening's hosts was played by the monk's mother, psychologist Tatiana Filipieva, and co-chairman of the Metropolitan Laurus Foundation, editor-in-chief of the magazine Bolshoi Washington, Sergei Kuznetsov. Portal-credo.eru reports with irony 4. There really is nothing to comment on here. 2. Killing priests is easy. The former cell attendant of Metropolitan Vitali, Father Pavel Ivashevich, is convinced that Archpriest Lebedev was poisoned. In 1986, Father Pavel Ivashevich himself mistakenly ate poisoned food intended for Metropolitan Vitali, whom the Kremlin also disliked very much and subsequently got rid of through its agents in the Synod. Then Father Pavel lost consciousness, and a Russian doctor called to him confirmed the poisoning. Fortunately, Father Pavel was 19 years old at the time, and his young body coped with the poisoning. but it still did not return to normal. Father Pavel still has to take stomach medications. Then he was ordered to keep silent about this incident. In 1970, Vladimir Yevshikov, a priest of the Australian and New Zealand diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, became an accidental witness to a Soviet intelligence operation at the customs office of the Australian city of Melbourne. Father Vladimir worked there in his free time from church services. After all, many priests from poor parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad had to look for additional income. If he were a professional counterintelligence agent, he would have immediately reported to the appropriate authorities and would have kept his mouth shut for the rest. But Father Vladimir was simply a priest and therefore told many of his brothers and even the bishop about what he had seen. And only after that did he go to the police. But the KGB agent network worked quickly, and Father Vladimir Yevshikov's car was rammed by a car, after which its driver approached Father Vladimir, who was still alive, and performed some manipulations on him. Father Vladimir was found with his hand extended to the icon of Blessed Xenia. The Australian police never found either the car or its driver. I think he was one of the Soviet illegal intelligence agents, an officer of the S Directorate, of the first main directorate of the KGB. Who knows, maybe I met him there later at festive party meetings. At the same time, in the 70s, KGB assassins chased the deacon of the Cathedral of the Resurrection of Christ in Buenos Aires through the streets. Oh, Pyotr Golofeyev, born in 1921 in Donbass, to a repressed businessman. He was a descendant of the Tsarist General Golofeyev, to whom Mir Lermontov was subordinate. A convinced anti-Soviet, Pyotr Kirillovich created an armed detachment to fight communism during the Second World War, the Hunting Team, which later retreated with the German army and joined the 5th Regiment of the Russian Corps of General Steifen. Deacon Golofeyev knew that in the socialist homeland he was sentenced to death, and so he was always on guard. He immediately recognized the Soviet killers in the Argentine crowd by their clothes and broke free and ran away from them after they had cornered him as he was getting off the bus. He managed to escape, but when he returned home, he found a poisoned needle in the folds of his leather coat. In 1975, Bishop Dionysius of Rotterdam died in Holland. Shortly before his death, he gathered Dutch journalists and told them that he was leaving the MP and joining the church abroad. The reason for this was the public statement of the Soviet Patriarch Paiman that people were not persecuted for their faith in the USSR. Metropolitan Anthony Blum of Suroch, a very intelligent and charming man in everyday life, had a strange attitude towards his death. During the Second World War, he fought in the ranks of the French partisans, the Maquis, who were subordinate to the French Communist Party and the NKVD. At the end of the war, Soviet intelligence officers contacted him and advised him to found a patriarchal parish in London in order to use confessions to report to the NKVD on the mood of the white emigration. The future Metropolitan Blum agreed and was soon promoted to Bishop of the Moscow Patriarchate. The famous English church writer Vladimir Moss told me about this incident. Shortly before the death of Bishop Dionysius of Rotterdam, Metropolitan Anthony informed Vladimir Moss's wife Olga that he was forced to leave for Holland to punish Bishop Dionysius for causing a serious crisis in the church. A few days later, Olga Moss herself found herself in Holland and even met with Bishop Dionysius's cell attendant, Father Arseny. He told her in tears that he had left the bishop alone for just a few hours after the liturgy to visit her parents, and when he returned, he found him dead. Did you know that Metropolitan Anthony visited Bishop Dionysius at that time? Olga Moss asked. I had no idea, Father Arseny admitted in horror. Metropolitan Anthony of Suroch was a professional surgeon. God alone knows how he used his skills on Bishop Dionysius of Rotterdam, but it is certain that this highly intelligent man was also a KGB militant. However, the most high-profile event of this kind was the murder of the head of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, Metropolitan Philaret, in 1985. A convinced anti-communist and anti-Soviet, an implacable opponent of any rapprochement with the Red Soviet Church, he was a thorn in the side of the KGB. Judge for yourself how prophetic his words about the MP turned out to be, speaking from the distant 1980. But it is not true orthodoxy that is spreading there. There, under the guise of orthodoxy, the Russian people are being presented with Bulgakovism, Berdyaevism, and other nonsense of the Evlogian schism. Sects flourish there, baptism, and so on. The official church preaches cooperation with the godless government, praising it in every way. The true Orthodox Church has gone into the catacombs hidden from the masses. Is this the revival of orthodoxy? 3. The unfaithful son, Father Potapov. The above words are taken from a letter by Metropolitan Philaret. Father Victor Potapov, the current rector of St. John the Baptist Cathedral in Washington, and the main driving force behind the transfer of the church abroad under Moscow's rule. Back then, in the stagnant and gloomy year of 1980, Father Victor Potapov declared that Russia was rising from the dead and that orthodoxy was being revived in it. That year, I already held a respectable post in the KGB, and I knew very well that orthodoxy was under our strict control and that there could be no talk of its revival. Soviet reality did not provide facts that could prompt Father Victor to such a conclusion. Such a conclusion could only have been instilled in him by his Soviet communist comrades. Yes, precisely by them, since non-communists were not allowed to travel abroad, although this is not customary to remember now. This means that Soviet communists were already working with Father Victor, agree that in more than a quarter of a century something could have been achieved. In the same letter, Metropolitan Philaret reproached Father Victor for commemorating one of the Soviet bishops at the Great Entrance. I don't know his name, but this bishop was probably a KGB agent, like all his other colleagues, and perhaps a member of the CPSU, because the top brass of the Patriarchate had party cards. Metropolitan Philaret categorically forbade not only prayerful communication with the Soviet Church, but even everyday contacts with the advisors. He, like Metropolitan Vitali, who replaced him as primate, objected to Father Victor Potapov's unauthorized trips to the USSR as a correspondent for the Voice of America, and even, as they say, were going to hand him over to a church court. Both metropolitans cannot be denied their foresight. After all, upon arrival in the USSR, Father Victor was entirely at the disposal of only one department, which was allowed to deal with representatives of the anti-Soviet Emigre Center, as the church abroad was called in the USSR. For all other citizens of the USSR, such communication was dangerous. This agency was called, after all, the State Security Committee, and not the Moscow Patriarchate or Intourist. Not only the MP hierarchs with whom Father Victor communicated were from the KGB, but also the maids and drivers, and also those who were not in Father Victor's sight, officers of the External Surveillance Service who tracked his every step, telephone operators of the OTU, Operational and Technical Directorate of the KGB, who eavesdropped on his telephone conversations, young grinning officers of the same department who watched Father Victor through the peephole in the ceiling of his hotel room. In KGB parlance, this is called an O event. And if you add to this the officers at Lubyanka who kept his file, and the bosses who imposed resolutions on him and reported them to Andropov, it becomes clear that each visit of Father Victor to the Soviet Union provided work for many fighters of the invisible front. His file could fill several bookcases now. I wonder what Father Victor's KGB pseudonym was. and it exists because it was forbidden to use the real name of the subject of the operational development. I am also sure that this pseudonym is mockingly contemptuous and is on the verge of decency, so that the boss would understand what kind of person is being discussed in it, even before reading the operational development file. For every anti-Soviet emigrant who arrived in the USSR, a case of operational development was opened. It is opened only for enemies of the state, for those suspected of hostility. A more lenient case of operational verification is opened. It can still be closed. But the case of operational development is the second and final stage of the KGB's interest in a person. It can only end in recruitment or arrest. Yes, and closure too, but then its authors face a scolding. The KGB had no intention of passively watching Far Victor for 25 years. After all, you have to get medals sometime. The first main directorate of the KGB, intelligence, the second, counterintelligence, and the fifth, the fight against religion, were probably involved in his development. Everyone wanted to get their hands on a fat American chicken. Yes, it is American, not Russian at all. The bureaucratic state of the Russian Federation determines a person's nationality solely by their passport and not by who they consider themselves to be. To the disappointment of numerous Russian immigrants, American admirers of the Russian Federation, mostly elderly and having never lived in Russia, I want to inform you that the Russian government also considers them only Americans. That is why the idea of this pseudo-national community is now being vigorously implanted in the Russian emigration by KGB agents. Here one can often hear the following idea: let us first unite with our Russian brothers in the bosom of the Church, and then explain to them why they are wrong. Alas, respected gentlemen, but not at all comrades, as people in the Russian Federation still address each other, no one will listen to you. They do not need overseas advisors. I am sure that the fact that Far Viktor Potapov was under KGB investigation for more than a quarter of a century somehow escaped the attention of the American authorities with their inappropriate political correctness. Soviet intelligence, on the contrary, surrounds with severe suspicion those who hobnob with Americans even at work. Therefore, we, its officers, were afraid to meet an American abroad once again, because this promised us a stamp in our personal file. Was under CIA investigation. This predetermined the end of a career. The KGB is much stricter with its employees than the CIA. It is especially important to understand this, because Far Viktor Potapov is an American civil servant. I think he has access to secrets. He has access to the White House and other important government institutions. The instinct of a former aide to the head of Soviet intelligence tells me that Far Viktor is presenting the surrender of the Church abroad to Chekist Moscow as some kind of subtle operation that is advantageous to America. Supposedly, the Church abroad will put pressure on the Patriarchate, and the Patriarchate on Putin, and alas, his words are met with great acclaim there. Re-educating Putin is a favorite American idea. They believe that he does not understand all the advantages of Western democracy, and they try their best to explain them to him. But in reality, the transition of Church abroad to the power of Putin's neo-Stalinist state does not bring any advantages to America. On the contrary, it creates a powerful threat to its national security. Now, Putin's intelligence is no longer afraid to kill U.S. citizens on the streets of Washington. I wonder if this will finally sober up the American authorities. Father Viktor Potapov benefits from the ambiguity of the historical moment, which the Soviet satirists Ilf and Petrov in the 1920s characterized as follows: the era of silent films is over, and the era of sound has not yet begun. The Russian Federation already loudly calls America enemy number one, but America still considers the Russian Federation a friend. But if Far Viktor were a citizen of the Russian Federation and worked so openly for America, We would have long ago imprisoned him for 15 years, like Doctor of Sciences Igor Sutyagin and other pro-Western intellectuals. 4. The murder of Metropolitan Philaret. The State Security Committee had been closing in on Metropolitan Philaret for a long time. In the early 1980s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation warned him that the Soviets were planning to shoot him during the Easter procession. The Metropolitan nevertheless went out to the procession, but the young subdeacons covered him with their bodies, and many Russian émigrés later wondered why Vladika Philaret was not visible. In 1984, a listening device disguised as several electric batteries was found in the shrine of the myrrh-streaming Montreal-Yverdon icon of the Mother of God, now lost. Experts from the American Secret Services, summoned by Bishop Gregory Grab, testified to this. But why was this fact not made public? Who would benefit from keeping it quiet except the KGB? After all, it was listening in on all the conversations that took place in the Synod meeting room, and only KGB agents with access to that room could have planted those batteries in the precious icon case. And then came the tragic day of November 19th, 1985. Metropolitan Philaret and all the bishops were poisoned at the meal, except for one, Hilarion, who dined separately. However, the doctor who was called for some reason diagnosed the flu, not poisoning. Protodeacon Nikita Chakarov, cell attendant of Metropolitan Philaret, was also declared ill with the flu. For sanitary reasons, he was strictly forbidden to go up to the Metropolitan's chambers. Thus, Bishop Philaret was left there alone for the entire night. There was not a soul on the entire floor of the Synod building either. Such a thing had never happened in the entire history of the Church abroad. Needless to say, the next morning, Bishop Philaret was found dead. He was lying on the floor, and there were traces of vomit all around. They could indicate poisoning and provide invaluable material in establishing the cause of death. Bishop Hilarion, who then and now openly worked for Moscow, came running to the cry of Far Nikita Chakarov, who had discovered the body. The first thing he did was send away his cell attendant. As many emigrants told me, after that he carefully washed the floor, moved the Metropolitan's body to the bed, and only then called the doctor. Naturally, he pronounced death from cardiac arrest. 15 years later, the tomb of Metropolitan Philaret was opened, and everyone saw that his relics were incorrupt. Many believers demanded canonization, but power in the church abroad had already been seized by Moscow's protégés. Metropolitan Loris ordered the relics to be buried 6, and even added a blasphemous phrase that let him rot like everyone else. They were even forbidden to distribute photographs of the incorrupt relics of Metropolitan Philaret. Iji Shatilova, the daughter of Bishop Gregory Grab, and his longtime assistant in secretarial work at the Synod, told me that shortly before his death, Bishop Philaret learned that the bishops close to him were deceiving him. Taking advantage of his ignorance of English, they slipped him the wrong documents to sign. The bishop was going to expose and even remove some bishops, but as usual, death washed away all traces. Why did the church abroad unite with its murderers? 1. This figure may be somewhat overstated. Author's note. 2. Vladimir Yulin, Werewolf, Right View, number 21, 121, November 2010. 3. 4. In prayerful solitude, monk Vsevolod Filipiev sent his poetic greeting to the participants of the evening in memory of Metropolitan Loris in Moscow. Portal-credo.ru, April 18, 2011. 5. An element of Orthodox worship, the liturgy. During it, the prepared holy gifts are transferred from the altar to the throne. 6. Transfer of the relics of Metropolitan Philaret, third first hierarch of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, testimony of a believer, Konstantin Preobrazhensky,